This is the reality of things now. This is the reality of things now. I'm just narrating to myself. My various narrations. All right. Yes, yes. All right. And here in the iterations of my natural self, a place where we all are. Okay, hold on. I wonder if I should say what I might have said before, if I should say that now in this moment that passes by, flowing like time does, flowing like existence does. I wonder if I can say that in the iterations of myself, I find them as I go along to be like the turning of the pages of a book, which is a natural thing, I guess, because the book, as well as other mediums and other dimensions, is where that's the natural place of the language arts. The language arts in the medium of the book, whose pages we turn as if we were shedding our own skins of what we were thinking the previous moment, if time is to be measured that way, if time is to be measured in that broken and piecemeal way, then indeed there would be much jaggedness, would there not? But one of the ways that art, in all its forms, though I'm speaking specifically of the language arts, one of the ways that these arts address the brokenness of the human condition is in drawing forth from the inner consciousness a vision, a further vision of what life is, and perhaps to lead us past, to lead us beyond this vision of what seems to be that vexes us so. So, this is already speaking in the spirit of a spirit, right? Speaking in the spirit of a spirit. A religion is already the forms in which that spirit is clothed, is it not? The forms in which a spirit is clothed are words, are they not? And so religion too is a language art. Okay. Art is a language art, right? Language art, yeah. And the gift, actually, to cross the line into a further kind of dimension of this kind of enriched sense of consciousness, which is there for us, to draw from as we understand the literature, the language art of Alan Watts. It is there for us to constantly draw on. Yes, so it's the spiritual gift, which is a common thing, actually, and here's a reason why it's common. The gift of teaching is what I could be talking about here, which we see exemplified. So with such grace in Alan Watts, who as a writer, as a speaker, as a teacher, as a persona, as a illustrated life pattern, a very unique life pattern, which is ours to contemplate the mystery of. Maybe we'll get into some of that, this in the next little while. All of these, though, are the language arts: religion, personal, spiritual gifts, however they manifest themselves, of course, yes. And so this is what makes Alan Watts so compelling, at least as the beginning, if we want to open up that door a little bit. Language arts. And Alan Watts is a unique exemplar of that, in which we can find inside the place where his language art is. We can look out through the windows and see all these other dimensions of understanding, you see, suggested to us with a skillful use of language. So skillful, like it's the vernacular. It's like the common speech. Everything that I'm talking about, Alan Watts conveyed in utterly simple terms that fit together in a way that was natural to his being. And this becomes an element of the wholeness of his teaching, you see, as that kind of exemplary figure. But such are the ideas themselves, I think, that we can, that's what we can draw on a little bit more, because also Alan Watts is a much criticized figure, and rightly so in so many ways. This is part of his teaching, part of what is there for us to be vexed by or nourished by, or to draw us on to understanding, well, what are our own thoughts about this? There are those who call Alan Watts, that he's a shallow charlatan, a fraud, a trickster, a phony, and other things slightly more, had various personal problems which caused a lot of suffering, which seemed to belie his message of wisdom. Or does it? Because again and again, Alan Watts returns us to the basic source of his thought, which is his flawed self. And he says it in so many terms, in so many ways, that it becomes something familiar to contemplate, even as it leaves us with these questions that still vex us. Alan Watts, man or myth? Well, both. Alan Watts, pro or con? How be so dualistic is that? So let's talk about more about what that might be or what that might mean. It's also, an Englishman coming to America at a particular time, an Englishman from a suburb of London called Chislehurst, which, as he describes it in his autobiography, In My Own Way, that's the title, which is a wonderful title with its two sides, In My Own Way and In My Own Way. And that becomes part of the theme of the book. Anyway, as described in his autobiography, In My Own Way, the place where he came from, the place of his nativity, was it was one of the villages of Old England. It was in Kent, and it was outside of London. But as London grew, it became absorbed into the greater municipality of London. But it's a place as Alan Watts was growing up there, he was born in 1915, and so he was the only child of two parents who were devoted to him, and moved to such a place as Chislehurst so that they could raise their child in the circumstances, where he could be surrounded by nature and see all the natural processes, because they had an appreciation of those beautiful natural things which were there for a child to explore in Chislehurst. He speaks about it in so many ways sometimes, of course. But, he went and gathered moths in the nighttime after putting treacle on the trees with his father. They walked about the village greens admiring the haystacks and things like this. The wonderful thatch-roofed, well, I don't know if they were thatched-roofed or not, shake-roofed pubs where you got the excellent cheeses and could drown yourself in ales and beer and all of these things, and were also excellent places to eat in a meal. And so here these are terms by which Alan Watts talks about his childhood and his growing up years and his time in Chislehurst, and you get the sense of the Englishness of it, and you also, you get the sense of the sophisticated hedonist. This is part of the this British thing, the inheritance, in Edwardian, Victorian, and even before that, from the chivalric days, this notion of the gentleman and the man of the world, and Alan Watts, that was part of his persona, part of his, we could say it this way, make-up. and he would speak of it with great humility, of how he was a made-up character, and he was a philosophical entertainer. And when he came to America, he crossed the border, I think, in Montreal, or from there, and was asked by the American customs agent on this side, what are you doing with it? Is that cane because are you sick? Is that why you carry a cane? And Alan Watts said, no, it's just for swank, and that seemed to please the customs agent, so he got passed, and all the things that conjures in your mind, and yeah, and then he metamorphosized over time into a countercultural figure at the other end. We could describe one arc or one current of the story of Alan Watts in that way, from the uptight, dandified, poser, um, from I don't know, upper, maybe just middle class, I don't know, but in beautiful circumstances where beauty was appreciated, which is part of that aristocratic ideal, of the good life which he was brought up in. And it became sincere early on in him to appreciate beautiful things, both of nature and of art. And whatever I was saying then, oh yes, the arc from the dandified, uptight English gentleman, eccentric also, of course, and which the British, are good at or accept or are known for, and it's important. Somewhat, yeah, eccentric, to the in the golden age of the Bay Area counterculture, you could say, in the blossoming of the human potential movement, of the consciousness, of the countercultural, the psychedelic, the hippie, all of these things. Alan Watts became a respectable and insightful role of this kind of like public sage and personality and presence. And the books circulated widely in popular presses. See this, and we return to the theme that his teaching, his language art, is in the vernacular, in the common speech. You see, it's not academic, and it's not even considered, like stanza page poetry written by a poet with a certain kind of persona, like that one would have back then. No, it was books that a person would read. Nowadays, they might, sometimes you could call them, in the self-help genre. Sometimes you could call them in the Zen writing genre. Sometimes you could call them in the New Age genre, and all of this stuff, because this is the nature of the vernacular also. The tastes go through all these kind of like very loose kind of labels and associations by which things can be dismissed, and Alan Watts, being so popular, is subject to that sometimes, in the critical eye. Anyway, but he becomes, the uptight English dandy, eccentric, into the eccentric, countercultural, religious visionary also, and fantastically marveled at bearer of a unique insight into the questions that people were given to express in public, spiritual things, and the ways that the culture was answering back to the spiritual and language consciousness, because people were reading for that. They were looking for that in all these different places in the universities, but also they would go, having touched on that spirit, in the college library, for example, perhaps having been inspired by a humanities or liberal arts teacher in such a way that one's interest is quickened, or one's insight into a certain theme, one realizes perhaps the pattern of one's own life in relation to the things that one finds in the college library as a student, perhaps. But then one goes out into the world and has to face all of the responsibilities of the necessities of life, and so the sets of challenges change, and we set these things aside sometimes. We might be drawn back to look at them in a certain way. And a writer like Alan Watts, for many, is able to be kind of a friendly helping hand, because the writing, if you like it, if it strikes you, for me at least, it becomes so easy to read in a certain sense. So easy to read, though, it becomes a challenge to get to the real meat and potatoes of it, you might say, to speak like an Englishman, or is that speaking like an American? I don't know. The meat and potatoes of it. So what is he really meaning? Let me say one more thing about Alan Watts, the religion arts, the language arts, and all of these things. I want to say something about, oh yes, the gift of teaching, and I want to take another step further into like what might be considered, a religious kind of language art, and that is the art of prophecy. And by prophecy, I don't mean to say that Alan Watts was a activist, spokesman of any kind, like so many in the 60s were. He eschewed that role as well as a lot of other things, in terms of roles, but other roles he embraced. But in spite of that, you see, in spite of all the cons, and many people understand this too, who, even if they have all these other reservations, it is, we know that there are times when his writings enter into uh, notions, painful human subjects, like notions of power, in society and culture. And so when I say prophecy in this case, I don't mean a political writer necessarily, but I mean kind of like a true insight into the nature of power, which of course is invisible, and yet it seems to move according to certain laws or patterns or ways. And then the prophet would be the one who shines a light into that, And Alan Watts does that. So the closer I get, to that, we can get to an actual deeper contact with his writings, which are there for us, and we'll go through some of them, of course. But I want to talk about his forebears a little bit, and his unique spiritual formation. His autobiography is a Bildungsroman, reveals him to be, and what many who understood him also understood, and was a key to understanding his gift, is that he was an autodidact. Even though he moved in all these sophisticated realms, and was a pioneer in specifically an academic institution in more ways than one, in more than one institution, I have to say. I mean, for example, he became for a while a teacher at they called it back then the American Academy of Asian Studies, and founded by Spiegelberg, who fled from the Nazis, and others, and religious syncretists, and more than anything, gifted true teachers, even though they were in the higher academic fields in Europe, of all places. But they were the ones that authoritarian forms of culture wanted out, and many were so lucky to get away. And America received them, and we can talk about that all in all those different ways for a long time. But anyway, so Spiegelberg, who Alan Watts knew him in England, and Alan Watts referred to him. I can't remember the one who set my inner compass. Who found the coordinate of my inner compass. He uses the word inner compass, but when he's using it, I wonder if he's the first one who uses that now cliched term, if indeed it is inner compass. I think that's what he said. And what oft was thought, but never so well said, right? That's the key to the understanding of like vernacular type literature. But anyway, so balances and notions of power. So, for example, in Alan Watts's formation as an autodidact, he went to King's School in Canterbury, and was deeply fluent in all the things that interested him, and could have gone to Oxford or Oxford, if only he had not, as he put it, written an essay, his application essay. He wrote it in a really flippant manner, that so alienated, the people, the admissions people, that he did not go, and he had no more formal schooling after that, believe it or not, though he taught at California Institute for Integral Studies, or what it was called back then, the American Academy for Asian Art. Some of his students then went on. Richard Price was one of his students there, who went on, along with Michael Murphy, to found the Esalen Institute, which was such a place of legend. And of course, Alan Watts, he had many stays there later on. And but even before that, he was the chaplain. Alan Watts, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. No, mainly in the 1940s, and up until about, I can't remember when he left the Episcopalian priesthood, because he was a priest. He was not a parish priest, but he was the chaplain at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And has a great deal of people were nourished by the community that formed around him, and they misbehaved a lot too, And of course, Alan Watts, from the time he was 13 or 16 or so, he declared himself to be a Buddhist, And it was okay with his mother and father, who were so, especially his father, they say, that's the reputation, was so very attuned to the intellectual or mental or vocational gifts of his son, that they were not alienated by, these otherwise staid, English folk. His mother came from missionary folk, and who also, her father taught at a school for missionaries, and it was the kind of Christianity which is, well, it was an oppressive presence in Alan Watts's early life, of course, as it would be for all the reasons, and yet here he is later on, by such a strange trajectory of circumstance, in America, as an Episcopalian priest, married to the daughter of the woman who did so much to bring formal Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, into the United States, both before and during the 1940s, Ruth Everett, who later became Ruth Sasaki, because she married Soke-an Sasaki, who was this notable Zen teacher, well known since the 1930s, the World Conference of Religions, and who was actually from Japan, a Japanese settler, and raised fruit, maybe as far south as Hayward, but certainly in Oregon, and then went back to Japan and officiated in Zen temples and things. And eventually, Ruth Everett married him after she was divorced, I think, from her husband, who was a prominent criminal law lawyer in Chicago. And, Alan Watts married her daughter, Eleanor. Yeah, and that's how Alan Watts came to America, you see. And he arrived in America about 1940. He was in America before, just by his own ways, and did not have to be in England at that time. Instead, became an Episcopalian priest, even though he was also a Buddhist, and found ways to reconcile those things. And certainly that brought that spirit to his work there. But it was his, destiny or life pattern to have it that these ideas which were forming in him, this river of thought which was brewing in him and flowing out of him as part of his natural gift to teach and to preach, allowed him to think in these far-reaching, even prophetic ways that, ran afoul at that time, of the church authorities. So for one reason or another, he left the priesthood. And some of the clergy understood him and were on his side, and others said no. And there was also probably something to do with his behavior and stuff. And I think by that time he had already been married to someone else, to Dorothy, and eventually, he had many. How do you put it now? How do you talk about it in such a way when you're talking about the romantic relationships of Alan Watts? These are the things that give him a certain reputation, but there were also many lifelong friends who at times were involved with him romantically, who always spoke profoundly, always spoke very insightfully of him, as well as his daughters. And so hold that, in your mind, because that also helps to realize that he was truly, in a certain sense, a man of God, though he did not speak of it in the ways that we associate the orthodoxy of that, you see. But anyway, so let me go back to when he was in England. What was his true formation? I will tell you. There was the tram, or whatever they call it, the lorry, from Chislehurst to London. You got to be back before midnight, or you might turn into a pumpkin. But because of that, he was able to commute to London, where, that was where he spoke of his true teachers, and he says in his autobiography, all the ones that I knew are my gurus, and I express myself through my feeling in relation to them, you see. Why? Because this is his nature is a social being. It's a kind of a social poetic gift, where at one time John Keats would talk about negative capability, the ability to hold in abeyance all the judgments of the critical intellect in order to receive the purest of impressions like the Aeolian harp. Well, Alan Watts, a similar thing is going on, but it is expressed in the terms more of a journeyman, of an actor, of of a charlatan, of a priest, which is also what that is, of a teacher who teaches by means of entertainment. You see, I love the simple thing he said about himself, and return to again and again, and it's rich every time he says it when he refers to himself as a philosophical entertainer, and that's very, very good, because that is a language art. Of course, because the art is in making a way through or avoiding the strictures of the limited attention span, holding it aside, setting it aside by means of offering it something more immediate to its actual interest, which it's not seen before, you see. And thus, boredom becomes, you could say curiosity, maybe best to say interest, really actual just interest, which is really essentially what is most necessary in spiritual growth and understanding, is simple interest, not necessarily a fantastically shattering illusion, though those make for interesting stories which will hold your interest. That's how the religious consciousness learns and grows, by being philosophically entertained in a certain way. You're working with it a little bit because there's no pictures, right, in Alan Watts when you're reading Alan Watts. And you're also, I at least am working with it a little bit sometimes. When I hear signs of also the nature of this guy who is kind of a networker too, and very much, a flatterer and something of a charmer, and who moved in all these circles, very ambitious in that sense, you could say that, but in fully involved in his real gift, then all that notion of ego is set aside. And what notions we have of the difficult ego of Alan Watts become, necessary and important counterpoints. Anyway, so just I want to say really quickly that he haunted the used bookstores. And at that time, this is like 1914, 1915, in London, and I cannot remember the name of the bookstore. The proprietor was Nigel Watkins, and his aged father, John Watkins. And this was the esoteric bookstore. And this was also where the interesting people came and went. And Alan Watts helps me a lot in my simple explorations into what really is the history of this kind of literature that gives rise, of this kind of consciousness, and these kind of people and artists, literary artists, who give rise to this kind of literature, which is so, I think, so key to understanding, our own imaginations and our cultures as well. All of the strange, spiritual, religious, historical, controversial maybe, but not for the reasons that you might think, kind of like documents and rumors and all of these things to be considered by those whose consciousness is not distracted by low-minded applications of such sublime subject matter. And to find manifestations of that, where do you go? You go to the dusty bookshelves and the out-of-the-way places, and proprieted by the people who understand, and who can offer, like, sometimes real insight into what we are interested in as we pursue the cognitive arts of reading. So such a place is where Alan Watts met many, many strange people. Well, yeah, but also such influential people as the guy with the great name, Christmas Humphreys, who usually went by Toby. Christmas Humphreys. He was the head of the Buddhist lodge in London in the early part of the 1900s, and he was also a well-known barrister, and became eventually a judge or a criminal law lawyer or something at the Old Bailey, they call it, which is the English criminal court, So he was that. And he also, like, made the newspapers sometimes and won victories and things in certain controversial cases as a lawyer. But he wrote, and you probably heard of them maybe if you find them in esoteric bookstores, all the great Buddhist books that Christmas Humphreys wrote. Toby wrote those, you see. And Toby took Alan Watts under his wing, you see, in a certain sense. And what I should say is mentored Alan Watts, as Alan Watts knew how to be mentored, having been able to find nourishment for his mind from ever since he was a kid. That gift carried over, you see. And and then he gets connected to the people who are very interesting, and this is the time when the Gurdjieffians were around. Well, of course, the Gurdjieffians. I could say in an entre nous kind of way, oh, they're always around, but that would be like a little bit of philosophical entertainment, But still, what I mean really specifically with the Gurdjieffian thing, one thing is, Gurdjieff, the archetypal charlatan, overpowering, mesmerizing, bald-headed, raven-browed, vaguely Eastern European accented, ultimate opener of the door, of 1,000 kind of exercises and thought patterns, and is not afraid, to fully confront, the ignorance of those underlings who seem to come to him wanting instruction. Well, he gives it to them, but that's part of his fascination. But then he also took care of them in a certain sense. And truly, many say, there are many like this. Okay, I just want to mention one that you might not have heard of. Dmitry Matrinovic was in London at this time. Dmitry Matrinovic was a Gurdjieff lookalike, I think, unless I'm wrong and I'm speaking too glibly. But he had the chrome dome and the bushy eyebrows, and he was Yugoslavian, you see. But he also had the vision. And of course, and the theatrical kind of aplomb. He, as Alan Watts described it, he would only show up, at about 11 p.m. At night. He was utterly nocturnal, and that made it difficult for Alan Watts to hang out, as part of his community, because he had to get back to Chislehurst, you see, before midnight to catch that tram. But one time though, he did stay at Matrinovic's, and learned things that he was asked never to speak of again. And that's Alan Watts, entertaining us a little bit, because it's actually the experience of those who express themselves in these symbolic and literary and captivating ways and theatrical ways, so powerfully that legends build up around them, but they understand how that works, and that becomes part of how their presence is in society and culture outside of their own times, why we're talking about them now, And so there are these theatrical presences. But anyway, Matrinovic, Alan Watts was able to convey to us that an essential thing with Alan Watts in his teaching is the unity between particularity and the universal, and how each one is kind of a face of the other, which is a basic insight, from the quote-unquote non-linear forms of thought, among them, which is, Eastern religion, as their reputation has come to be, as we've come to learn of them, the non-linear ways of understanding. So from Matrinovic, presented to him perhaps late one night after they had all, entered the realms of a complete and utter contemplation, Matrinovic was able to speak of an essential part of his understanding, and that was between the many and the one, or the particular and the universal, or I think the words he used were unity and diversification. I think that's how he put it. And Alan Watts relates that Matrinovic used the image of the face of a fox to show the principle of differentiation. And then Alan Watts, prestidigitator that he is in words, says, yes, I was able to look at the fox, the face of the fox, and see galaxy M81 or something like this, And it's said kind of in an offhand way, but then, well, first of all, right, you're talking about a theatrical personality doing like his own home theater, and it's serious and true stuff. It's never going to be filmed. It don't belong to be recorded by no machine, you see, because it's the oral tradition. And nevertheless, it travels from through memory into speech and through memory again. And that subjects it to all kinds of magical changes of their own, which are maybe of a unity with the original thing that was put out there. Anyway, but I have to ask, the image of the face of a fox, well, I can imagine, it couldn't have been this because this is London, urbane, an urbane situation. These are Europeans, as stylized as they are, they're not going to get too kooky. Well, they're going to get kooky, but they're not going to get too wild in a certain sense as to put on a fox mask all of a sudden, but maybe it was that kind of presentation, but more likely, I think it was a simple metaphor used as freely as Alan Watts conveyed it, So I think that's just a little bit of the taste of the way that these kind of ideas can come about. The fox's face, has a forward kind of pinnacle. It has an extension in three-dimensional space, and then there's all these layers all around it, and all these features of it. And yet you can look into it and you can see the face of a flower. And if you can see the face of the flower, then you can see the exfoliating, the expanding, the circular, the boundless and the bounded, and all of this. That's kind of that tone of things. But the mind has to be aware that language is doing that all the time. So you want me to tell you something then? So let's see. His dialogue actually included not only religionists and philosophers, but scientists as well, and also a lot of popular science books that were actually very good, and they were well known at the time and circulated kind of in a similar fashion, you see, because as a social gift, Alan Watts was bringing about this connection between all these different thinkers, and as a language artist, not limited to any particular form or medium, his letters are some of the most wonderful things and insightful things that you will ever read, I think, when you're talking about such a teacher as Alan Watts is, because he's just talking to that person, you see. So it's not really a public thing. And in another sense, though, he's connected to that person probably out of some network. So he's some kind of public figure of some kind. But anyway, so this is a letter that Alan Watts wrote to a morphologist. Okay, a morphologist is someone who studies forms. I'm sure there's a scientific language of morphology that is at play here. But here's Alan Watts in a personal letter responding to it. Dear Lance, and he was writing to L.L. White, who is the author of this book called an essay called Towards a Science of Form. I have read your essay, Towards a Science of Form, with real delight. For me, you are one of the 6 most stimulating people in the world, and here, as in the next development in man, which absolutely must be reprinted, you have done it again. Okay, I just want to marginally gloss a little bit. That's flattery stuff. That's the way you flatter. It's flattering, but that's okay. That's part of the form of this kind of letter. You're expressing enthusiasm, you see, and if you're sincere, and Alan Watts in this way, is sincere, but it's also, I just want to say, because it's stylized in so many ways, and that's kind of an example of that, socially speaking, in the social sense of a letter, of a personal letter. But anyway, back to the text. This is the second paragraph. In passing, have you read The Laws of Form by G. Spencer Brown, published by Allen and Unwin in London? John Lilly brought it to my attention, and I think you would find it important and interesting. He's building the connections, and he's mentioning John Lilly, of course, and it would be name dropping, because John Lilly is the dolphin guy and also the explorer of consciousness, also very much in that vein, of the pioneering West Coast thinker, the pioneering scientific thinker who crosses the lines into these transcendental modes of insight and inspiration, or, crazy, studying dolphins, what? But anyway, Alan Watts and him, they had an understanding of each other that they expressed in the basic fact that they were both born on the same day, January 6, 1915, and almost at the same time. And so, in a certain sense, they regarded each other as certain kinds of esoteric twins, and that's it becomes very fun to read when you realize the ways that you can like make a joke out of that, you know. But anyway, I want to think out loud with you. And also with us too, huh? Right now. I want to think out loud with you. That's Alan Watts saying that. Our problem in understanding the morphic process is that we are trying to translate it into the terms of the English language or mathematics. If we can do this, we shall feel secure in our understanding. But what leads us to suppose that we need this kind of security? We may be creating a false problem, like that of trisecting angles with ruler and compass. Hereafter, the word language will mean both spoken, written, and mathematical symbols of process, strung out in lines, whether on paper or magnetic tape. Simply, is it really possible to translate morphic process into this form, morphic processes into this form? Is it really possible into language which is definitely this, as he described it? Morphic process involves more simultaneous and rapidly moving variables than can be set out in lines, occupying the same time spans as the processes themselves. Let me read that sentence again. Morphic process involves more simultaneous and rapidly moving variables than can be set out in lines occupying the same time spans as the processes themselves. In other words, you know what that is really? That's nice and factual and vernacular, but as a storyteller, you would say it happens more quickly than the time it takes to tell. You know, it happens more quickly than the time it takes to tell. But even by using the word quickly, I'm still limiting it to this kind of form of time. But that's the nature of language as a form in its relation to these other forms. But when it comes to morphic forms, Alan Watts seems to be dialoguing with us. When it comes to morphic forms, there's too much simultaneity, too much going on, too much simultaneity, so many things, there's your differentiation going on, that it becomes simultaneity. There's your unity, you see. So Alan Watts, as a language artist, shows us a way to find, enrichments to our thought in all these different places. And I like to say, in the way we read, because that's how we can get a hold of him these days, or we can listen to the recordings of his voice that are out there. There's just numberless, almost numberless, and the mind, the thought is there also. But let's look further here. If we cannot find language for morphic processes, this is to say what mystics have always said, that the vision of reality is ineffable. This seems to be saying that our efforts to understand morphic process must come to a dead end, blind alley, failure. But, see, he says but to the dead end, because it's the nature of the wave to go on. But, he asks, must understanding be restricted to understanding in terms of language? Must understanding be restricted to understanding in terms of language? I understand how to open and close my hand, but I cannot tell you how it is done. So that's a way that Alan Watts these were some of his basic metaphors and things that you do, when you're speaking in simple terms. You just offer these simple kind of metaphors for what you're talking about. And so this is to say, among so many things, that Alan Watts, for me right now, is reminding me that language, which consists of, the things that he described, the substructures, sentences and forms strung out in lines, symbols of process, but also more than spoken and written, but also mathematical, symbols of process strung out in lines. And don't you use also those terms to describe, things like psychological states or most anything like that? And yet, Morphic form introduces us to the theory of morphic form, or the understanding of morphic form, or the teaching of morphic form. Introduces us to a notion where the simultaneity is such that to restrict it to lines of language, building blocks and constructions of this kind, is only just, it's just partial, you see. And yet we have a word for simultaneity, We have a word for God. We have all these words for it. So what's going on? What's up with that, We still have that. Why? Why? Because it's a task we put on ourselves as part of the dance, Alan Watts might say in other in other ways. So he goes on to say, the intellectual task, the burden of that. The intellectual task is to demonstrate in intellectual terms, i.e. language, that why this is so, as if to make it plain that an important event can really come to pass without its being reported in the newspapers or seen on television. Perhaps morphic process can take care of itself and has no need of being monitored by suspicious inspectors who cannot in any case monitor their own monitoring, etc. You are saying in a new way that the Tao, which can be explained, is not the eternal Tao, for Tao is exactly what you mean by morphic process, which is Zujan, of itself so, or spontaneous, and functions by a principle of order called Li, which first meant the markings in jade and the grain in wood, which are, of course, the permanent traces of patterns in the flow of liquid. And so, language and science are themselves events in morphic process, and their function is to go on putting themselves peacefully and reasonably to rest. Science is optimal when it is done in the same way as art, in the realization that it is not necessary. Thus, anyone engaged in pure research cannot and must not be so pressed for results or made to work by the clock. A fine intellectual... No, I'm sorry. That's a big mistake. That's a Freudian slip. What he writes is, a fine intellect must be trusted in the same way as morphic process must be trusted. So you see, I could go on and on with that. But I just want to say, now I am brought to come to, almost believing that it could be true that Alan Watts seems to be relating, perhaps just to me, that though language, the symbols in process, lines, cannot express the simultaneity of morphic forms, because, or also though, that language itself is a morphic form, right? In transit, in process, the means that we have to describe what is going on is what is going on, right? Or at least a part of it, you see. We step into that, and I think that is the kind of the simple way that our basic daily vocabulary and understanding can be nourished and enriched by how Alan Watts moves and thinks and expresses, and how we respond to it, because it's social writing, it's conversational. That's the nature of the language art, you see. And that art serves us well when it can open the door to what is available to us each day as necessity. We have to learn how to say what we mean. We have to learn how to understand what it is that we think, and we have to see how it is and it isn't, and we have to stay with all the ways that can, disorient us, so to speak, because you cannot have orientation without disorientation. You might say, movement involves a dynamic balance, you see. These are the kind of universal things that Alan Watts kind of gives us the means of understanding. But now I wanted to jump back to something. I just want to do this, yeah. I want to just read something about a nature of political thought that that Alan Watts can help us to understand, and that is his as an autodidact. I want to say, though, like I say, he eschews any idea that he's a political kind of writer. So when I say prophetic, I want to return to that sort of. I'm not talking about a political writer, but think of the way that he describes some of these actually classic underground political notions and ideas. When he describes something that his that the Yugoslavian guy, I'm blanking on his name. It begins with an M. Yeah, Mitrinovic. Mitrinovic was a refugee of sorts. He was a diplomat, but he was from Yugoslavia. He was involved in this literary, philosophical, and I guess you could it's described as so broad, a political movement, called the New Bosnia or the Young Bosnia movement. And this was in the years they were in resistance to Habsburg domination, and that was the political side of it, you see. And I have to say that Gavrilo Princip was a member, or was associated with them, but he was also associated with factions and secret, strange factions in the Serbian military, the Black Hand Society, which was not what the New Bosnia thing, but and also, this is the nature also of just public speech and public knowledge, and the vernacular is also this, these histories, these historical episodes, and the disturbing resonances of them when we look at them to try and understand the uncertainties of today, and but Mitrinovic was nothing like this, you see. He was a visionary. He was a true philosophical visionary and an influential art critic, and with a very forward-thinking understanding of he was a champion of the Blue Riders, Kandinsky and Paul Klee and those others. He eventually left Belgrade and came to Munich, where he was involved with the abstract expressionists, and I have to say the futurists, which is kind of weird, because they have unsavory figures, or the futurists. They had a thing. They saw technology as a dynamic kind of beautiful form. They tried to see the beauty in the onslaught of industrial forms and certain kinds of power. That was, but not this guy, not Mitrinovic. Mitrinovic denounced Hitler in the early 30s, as soon as Hitler took power. Mitrinovic, and he was able to use prophetic understanding. Hitler, something he said, is a twisted kind of sorcerer, or something like that. He spoke of it in his own esoteric terms, and he knew specifically what he was talking about and what he was expressing, because he saw that what was happening here was this energy of public attention, unformed, unfocused, therefore easily captured by the prestidigitation of language. Language is a form of magic, that he saw, in Hitler, and saw that it was not good. And he was also, he had, as well as, he wrote for that great periodical put out by Orage, in the 19-teens, The New Age, I think it was called. And he's well respected. People loved him for his wild, intensely, kind of mystical kind of. It was like primitive, but from a different part of the forest, than those Western Europeans were used to. And so something about his whole thing, just like with Alan Watts, he had that look. Well, his ideas did too, and it means a whole lot. It moves a lot of energy. Anyway, he also, according to Alan Watts, he teaches me this. He founded a movement he helped to contribute to a social movement in Britain called the New Britain movement, and they were anti-Nazi, of course, and they had a vision of society which Alan Watts put in very succinct terms, and we can just notate it, just to see the background of some of the things that we might be reminded of in other contexts, The New Britain movement proposed 4 basic changes in the social order. The first was social credit, based on the economic philosophies of, well, he mentions various people, among them Ezra Pound, who kind of had some problems, but the social credit in and of itself was an economic kind of concept of a kind of poetic economic. It was like this. Alan Watts describes it very well. This is part of his language art. It's part of his teacher gift. The first was social credit, who had realized that money was an abstraction, a mere measure of real wealth, such as land, food, and clothing. They suggested that in a technological society, there should be a national dividend paying people for the work done on their behalf by machinery, since there would otherwise be an economic slump with manufacturers unable to move their goods off the shelf. This view is still held today by Buckminster Fuller and Robert Theobald. The trouble is that it transfers the power of issuing credit from the bankers to the state. This is succinct and, insightful in its way. And Alan Watts is this is a notion of a certain kind of history. Alan Watts is not known to be good at conveying, and yet this is in his autobiography, and he's talking about what he learned from Mitrinovic. Anyway, the second feature of their vision of society, of the New Britain movement, was, and I love this, guild socialism, which means, roughly, that workers should be stockholders in the corporations which employ them, so that there is no longer any class of expendable people who are mere hands. The third, and this is also kind of from the esoteric field, because he mentions it, Rudolf Steiner. The third was Rudolf Steiner's idea of the threefold state, comprising a political assembly elected by a region, an economic assembly elected by guilds or unions, and a cultural assembly elected by universities and learned societies, all regulated and dominated by a senate appointed by the various assemblies. Anyway, and then he says this, very English, but it still is basic and true, and this is also part of the informal nature of one who's speaking to you. People, of course, have forgotten that a republic, such as the United States was intended to be, is quite different from a mobocracy, ruled by referendum. It is not without reason that we had a college of electors for the presidency, since most people have neither knowledge nor real interest in high politics, no acquaintance with the men contending for presidency, and are easily swayed by skillfully contrived propaganda. And then listen to this. This is where he brings in, we had it in mind that for England, the reigning monarch should be a chairman of the Senate and thus have something more important to do than laying the foundation stones of hospitals and viewing the races at Ascot. So in other words, they wanted the king to not be just a figurehead. This is an idea in the design for a society. Let me say one more thing about it, the internationalist part. Because all of these ideas, you see reflections of them everywhere, but I'm just talking about the way that they're thought originally as terms of language art, actually. You put them into action, and that's putting the fly in glass, or what you say. That's caging the fossil in the amber. That's trying to, pin the tail on the donkey. That's trying, or as Alan Watts said, and I love this metaphor, that's like trying to iron water. That's what politics tend to become, right? Because it must feed on human interest and attention in a different way than the sublime language art. Nevertheless, let's talk about internationalism for just a moment as it was historically manifested in the vision of Mitrinovic. The fourth basic change was to press for immediate federation of all the nations of Europe. And Alan Watts is writing this in about 1969 or so. A system now at last muddling into being with the common market and the relaxation of passports and customs inspections at the borders. When we last drove into Switzerland, a policeman simply looked into the car and told us to move along. But when Hitler came into power in 1934, Mitrinovic said, no, the New Britain movement invoked the governments of England and France to use force, if necessary, to prevent his refortification of the Rhineland in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. And it would have worked. As Lao Tzu suggested, eliminate problems at their beginning when they are weak. But all this was to no avail, and I decided to drop out of politics. That's Alan Watts writing about that. For him, we could say, oh, it was just this. It's a story that he tells us. And just for me, in that description of those kind of like, foundational thoughts, not policy platforms or in any sense, I don't think. Even though the ones who conveyed it were living in wildly hopeful times, with kind of a hope almost out of control, and it could make them very reckless. They didn't know any better. But now we, in our time, coming to understand what we are coming to understand, I think we can begin more and more, or continue to more and more, to see the value of finding the ways where sometimes like volatile notions, or they're not volatile in and of themselves, but I at least imagine all kinds of volatile things happening off of them, like the vapor that they give off. But that's just the way I think of it, And the way for me to tune my thoughts and to tune my understandings of these impure kind of fumes is to enter more deeply into the flow of what the language arts teach the practitioner, And so like the ascesis is the changing nature of all things and all forms, and the uncertainty of all the ways that human judgment and knowledge try to arrive at a secure point. And the practice is to learn to understand it when Alan Watts or life itself teaches us that the certainty that is not to be found in all the ways, that you're looking for and demanding, that certainty is not there. But once you understand that, you see, there's this dance of certainty and uncertainty, and there is a way, and that's a big, important word always, but especially Alan Watts. He uses it in his titles, he uses it in his jokes. There is a way to move in such a way in this that your understanding, and your basic sense of well-being, from your survival to your contemplative food, is made more near at hand to you if you allow your vision of life to be educated by the riches that are available in language, and that includes the riches of religious thought and political thought and all of these things. But you don't swallow them hook, line, and sinker, and there's all kinds of ways to remind people of that, humorous ways, but also ways to remind them of that by making mistakes and being, all your flaws and all, no teacher would be afraid to be a fool if that meant they were furthering the teaching in that way. And Alan Watts is in touch with that level, that basic level of understanding. But then again, I want to mention another thing and go off into a different thing. I mentioned his dialogue in connection to the scientist, the morphologist, L.L. White. And now, if I can reach into this, I want to, from his letters, I guess I'm reading from his letters some, and also a little bit from his autobiography. Everything he writes is an expression of some aspect of his gift, because he was doing it for a living, as he lived and breathed. And that gives us a certain kind of, that's how we have to understand the form and the way that it is working. Sometimes you can read his writings and understand that the original sentence is taking place in a room full of people. Other times you can read his writing and realize, this is kind of meant for the radio or something. But always, when you read his writings, it's recognizably him, you see, even amidst all the changes in style and subject matter that you can, kind of see in him. And so this is such a unique and so very simple kind of like profundity. You know what it's like? I think it might be like like pop music, popular music, certain popular music tunes are so, they're, that you haven't heard them before, but what makes them so appealing is, why haven't you heard them before? Or it's something you've always heard before, but this is the first time that you hear it this way, and it's a certain kind of tune that is so common, and yet it's just so right. It strikes your inner compass in a certain kind of way, and yet you can turn away from it and think, yeah, but it's meant to entertain. It's meant to pass a moment, to pass by. Yes, it is. It's meant to pass a moment, but it suspends the attention, right? The willing suspension of disbelief that Coleridge talked about. It's very much that kind of thing, and comes in under the radar so often. And so, yeah, that's just how it can be. But in his genres, in mentions of his genres. But I wanted to read a letter that he wrote, and he was vexed. This is a letter that Alan Watts, the great guru, the high poobah of the wisdom of insecurity, was kind of offended when Reinhold Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr, he's the guy who wrote Moral Man in Immoral Society. Hillary Clinton made reference to Reinhold Niebuhr. Many American Christian politicians acknowledge Reinhold Niebuhr as a thinker that they learn from. Maybe he's a theologian who went farther into the political questions of power and real politic, so to speak. I mean, that's kind of the area that he was talking about, only from, in a consistent, and inspired kind of way, holding to the original Christian vision, but understanding, well, just like the title, Moral Man, and there's the word man again, I know, but moral man in immoral society. There is this contradiction, and there's no use pussyfooting around it, for a Christian, especially a Christian involved in perhaps, having certain kind of responsibilities, in notions of state and stuff. And this is the reason why he has this certain kind of real serious attention. He's not any kind of like anything but a consciousness expander in that sense. It's like the card hold basic moral facts, but it's insightful and it's warm because it comes truly from the place of Christian agape and beneficence. But how does one maintain that in a world that is sometimes is totally against that, and yet recognize the need to wield power. It came out of the wartime thing, the Second World War. That was why his writings resonate. So there's a lot more to him than that. But it's also true that he wrote a bad review, and you can well imagine after the way I've described it, maybe he wrote an unsatisfactory review of one of Alan Watts's books later on. When Alan Watts, I think it was the book Alan Watts wrote called The Supreme Identity, and he was writing about, it was a syncretic kind of religious book, a religious synthesizing thinker, and so he was writing about, God. This is Alan Watts's book, The Supreme Identity. Sometimes Orthodox theologians, they have a term, esiogesis, as opposed to exegesis. Exegesis is in all, scriptural, language arts is, the interpretation or the understanding or the meaning brought out of a text, and it's a sober undertaking. But esiogesis is like, that's the subjective side of it. That's reading into the text. I mean, that's people can like put you down for that, but there's all kinds of ways to understand this play between the seriousness and the non-serious, and the subjective and the objective, and the legitimate and the pathfindingly illegitimate, and the wise and the foolish. Always these things are in dynamic play. So it's no put down for people to say Alan Watts is an esiogesis, as long as there's real insight there. And of course, I'm saying in so many ways that there is. But anyway. But so Reinhold Niebuhr he got an unsatisfactory review, and so Alan Watts You might think, how petulant. But no, he's an author defending the reputation of this work in the field of, it's a field of conflict. It's writers vying for the attention of the public, and this was a time when it was fully in line for him to play that part, I suppose, and this is how he did it. So he writes this letter from Millbrook, New York, by the way, in 1950 to Reinhold Niebuhr. Dear Dr. Niebuhr, when I learned that you might be reviewing my book, The Supreme Identity, I was very much looking forward to the kind of penetrating criticism of positions with which you do not agree, such as I find in your books. Having published this work somewhat tentatively, I am rather anxious to know just what are its faults from the standpoint of theological positions such as you own. And this is really sincere, and these are really important and good questions. This is the questions that people who are members of learning communities speak of when they're being truthful, frank with each other. Anyway, here's the second paragraph. Now that I have seen your review of my book in The Nation, I am at a loss what to think. I thank you for your comments on the book's intellectual caliber, but what you have criticized is a viewpoint as remote from that of the book itself as one could imagine. Indeed, you have criticized it for holding ideas which it was most plainly opposed. The comparative quotations, which I enclose, are but a small part of what might be produced to show the total difference between what I have said and what you have alleged that I said. I cannot conceive that you rushed into print without reading the book, nor that my meaning can have been all that obscure without, especially to one trained in philosophical and theological discourse. He's speaking very frankly with Reinhold Niebuhr, and saying, look, did you read this thing? What you have criticized is that odd travesty of Oriental metaphysic, which is an idea fixe in the minds of some theologians, a version of the Oriental doctrine which it was an express purpose of the book to correct. I can understand you taking issue with the corrections, but you have passed them by unnoticed and represented me as holding to the original travesty. I am still eager to know what your criticism of the actual book would be, and I wish you would ask Margaret Bloch if you might review it again for the Review of Religions or some such periodical, after, if I may tacitly suggest it, another reading. So not only, I'm asking you, did you read this? But if you read it again, or if you read it, you could offer it to this place, So he's like networking. He's suggesting that it could be done because he's working to further the understanding that he knows is there, and he's obligated, in the nature of the way that these things are communicated, and hashed out and worked out as part of the discipline and ascesis, of being a language artist in the public sphere, these pointed and so sincere and true questions to the great Reinhold Niebuhr, who replied, and I think the next review, Alan Watts liked it very much. But then Alan Watts went on to say some things that start to get kind of prophetic. And I do wish to read this to you. It's probably about 3 minutes to read. I'm saying that because I want to attend to the meaning in it, to open this door into this prophetic nature of Alan Watts and how he gets there in the context of just conversation about many subjects. Anyway, to Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr, thank you very much for your kind letter of December 6th. It seems to me that the difficulties between the Christian and metaphysical views and mystical metaphysical views of the nature of selfhood cannot be clarified so long as it is thought that the latter involves a denial of particularity. You see? In other words, Reinhold Niebuhr must have been thinking that, when the Eastern religionists say, there is no self, they are denying the particularity, of the individual, and that is the language of nullity. There's that generalization that it's all is one, kind of thing. And Alan Watts specifically, it's important as an educator of the public that he address these things in as specific way as he can. So he's saying, well, now wait a minute here. Let's look at this a little bit more. And so he does. In a letter to Reinhold Niebuhr, I insisted again and again in my book that this denial, the denial of particular selfhood, is not involved, except in the sense that if anyone would be my disciple, let him deny himself. He's quoting scripture. The Christian and the mystic, as I understand the latter, both agree that this denial is the necessary prelude to the flowering of personality in all its uniqueness. After many years' study of the Oriental traditions, I'm absolutely convinced that, only with certain exceptions, do they envisage any obliteration of particularity. Mahayana Buddhism in particular, in the Bodhisattva doctrine, culminates in a tremendous affirmation of the finite and the particular, so much so that no informed person can go on saying that Oriental mysticism omits the "nevertheless I live." And that's also from Scripture. Nevertheless I live. I don't think we can begin to discuss the problem unless that much is clear. The reduction of all differentiated forms to the one or to the void is not the final word of either Buddhism, Taoism, or even the Vedanta. But what lies beyond this point cannot really be expressed in words. Negative language is used to negate not the real world, but the adequacy of all verbal symbols for the understanding of reality. There we are again, the nature of language as a form in relation to these sublime truths. And the confusion there, he's simply trying to clarify, But that's what I'm saying. Here's what he's saying. When it is said that the ultimate reality is non-finite, non-being, non-formal, the negation applies to the words finite, being, form, etc., and not to the realities to which these words are attached. This is simple semantics. The word tree is a noise. The objective tree is not this noise, nor is it some static idea of tree in the human mind. In other words, the metaphysical traditions are saying that reality, whether divine or finite, is not comprehended in any static system of words or concepts. The negations apply to all these systems, not to the real things which they attempt to symbolize and comprehend. This point of view seems to me to coincide exactly with the Hebraic second commandment, no graven image, whether of wood or of thought, can be anything but a misleading symbol of God. We must know God as we know the tree, not by defining it verbally or conceptually, save for conventional purposes, not to be taken seriously, but by immediate perception. Thus, the mystery of life is not seen as a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. The real dynamic world can never be composed to correspond, it can never be made to correspond to any static system of symbols, measures, ideas, etc. These are useful conventions, like imaginary lines of latitude and longitude. Okay? And then, actually, I think Alan Watts in that book talked about, and maybe extolled, actually. I would read the whole paragraph, but I think I'll skip over that for time's sake. But Alan Watts, I am of a mind, because I haven't read this book, like Reinhold Niebuhr evidently didn't at first, but I think that Alan Watts at a certain point was extolling the agrarian economy, the village economy, because that's a very Taoist kind of understanding of the simple, basic forms of life and the way that the earth feeds you out of your locality, of your original being and the place where it is, and that can have, contexts of realistic practicality, consider the place, out of which Taoism arose. So I think it was something like that. But Reinhold Niebuhr, he's doing his thing here, though, of the immoral man and moral man and immoral society, where I think he was saying, well, yeah, but he probably was saying something like, I imagine him of a mind saying something like, yeah, but we don't live in a village economy. We don't live in a simple peasant economy. We live in these arenas of competing interests, sometimes backed up with incredible industrial might, and that is where we have to live out sincerely the terms of what we have learned from the example of Christ. And so, but Alan Watts, he's saying that, well, he replies in this way. He says, I think there are finite limits within which man must live, and that our high-grade economy is something like the dinosaur. Too big to be manageable. Do you know Wiener's book Cybernetics? He points out the danger that both the civilized brain and the civilized society have become like an overloaded telephone exchange, or a skyscraper too high for efficiency, because the higher you build it, the more floor spaces must be devoted to elevators. That's beautiful, upward mobility, right? That's very limited movement, and it has limits, does it not? But here's back to Alan Watts. In being redeemed from the agrarian economy, Oriental society, witness Japan and communist China, is becoming an immense danger, because our economy, which they are adopting, is a manifestation of insatiable desire. It must expand or collapse, which means imperialism and limitless exploitation of natural resources. This, rather than any metaphysical mysticism, seems to me to be the spirit which would abolish finite particularity. For to technology, the world ceases to be solid, real, and substantial. It becomes a vast electric field in which anything is possible, in which the splendid boundaries of time and space, i.e. the shapes of things, are obliterated. You know what he's talking about, don't you? He seems to be reaching to that in terms that are a direct answer to Mr. Religious Realist, saying what really is the denial of particularity is this limited, finite manifestation of desire, which is not restrained by any spirit, much less a religious spirit of any kind, you see. And Alan Watts is looking at it just in the sense of, this is what's going on, as I experience it in my mind, and as I express with my gift. But it's part of a dialogue with Reinhold Niebuhr. And I know that dialogue goes on and on and on. And sometimes we are, gifted to be allowed to peek into it. And now I know, I think it's probably time for me to wind this up. And so I know just exactly what will be so nice as a way to bring it to its place of, to this point in the dance, And this is, Gary Snyder has said some really cogent things about Alan Watts, like so many who knew him, you see. I want to emphasize, one more time now, finally, that this is all happening, this flowering of thought, all these expressions, when we look at them in all their international kind of ways and all these different kind of synesthesia, of impact and understanding about our times, is also a unique manifestation of something here in our locality in the Bay Area, where the walking and the talking, the walking of the walk and the talking of the talk and the speaking of the truth was to other individuals who likewise had this deep interest in understanding in a serious way, so that they could put their gifts in the service of a true culture and a true society and a true understanding, you see. And so Gary Snyder and Alan Watts, they were compañeros, in this way, Anyway, so Gary Snyder in an interview, I don't remember, I don't know when it was. It might have been 1978 or something, when Gary Snyder was talking about this, remembering Alan Watts, who did pass away in, I don't remember, 1971 or something like that. He only lived, he didn't make it to 60. because of some of the excesses in his personal habits. They say, it was just he was under a lot of stress and stuff. And I think also he was actually cranking it out to such a degree that, the fluency was there in the act of putting it out there like that. But the physical form was very much overextended, And so, a lot of people just, they say, well, it shouldn't have been that way. But that's part of his daemon, Oh, I don't know what his parentheses are. He was born in 1915, and he lived to be just shy of 59, I think. Anyway, but here's Gary Snyder on Alan Watts. I knew Alan from 1952 or 53. First met him at the Friday evening study group meeting at the Berkeley Buddhist Church, which is still right there off Shattuck Avenue, Then met him going to a talk he gave at the American Academy for Asian Studies, which is over there in San Francisco. It's now the Institute for Integral Studies over here in San Francisco. Anyway, so I met him twice. I met him there as a fellowship of this church, actually, as a fellow parishioner. I don't know if they use the word parish. Certainly Alan Watts grew up referring to it that way. They went to church together. Isn't that interesting? But then Gary Snyder attended one of his functions there at the California, or the American Academy for Asian Studies. Anyway, I met Alan when and Gary Snyder was much younger, but he says, I met Alan when he was still a young kid. Middle 30s is all he was. Alan Watts, middle or late 30s is when Gary Snyder met him. Then he wrote these series of books. So Gary Snyder is saying, I knew him when he was young. Then he wrote these series of books. Alan was a unique man. He had such an articulate, fluid way of thinking. He made everything look effortless and blameless. And in being that way, he imparted confidence to everybody. He was later faulted for various things, like never having done Zen practice himself, and so forth. But just take the phenomenon of his writings, and I think that one has to agree that they do no harm, and that they often do good, that they help people understand themselves and their lives. It's a kind of pop psychology. It's a kind of pop Zen, but it is on a higher level if you want to go back and read them, by far, than a lot of the pop psychology, pop Zen stuff that's being written now. A lot deeper, a lot more learned, a lot more subtle. But we've just thrown up our hands and sort of given up about pop psychology, pop Zen. Now we don't even bother to critique it. It's just out there. So you might say that Alan paved the way for that, but you might also say that Alan did it right. And culturally speaking, he made a real contribution to the United States, particularly in his presence in the Bay Area. He made life in the Bay Area that much better. He was a really interesting guy, and I really enjoyed meeting him and liked him, loved him a lot. So that's Gary Snyder saying that. He said some other things too, but I just want to say, how Gary Snyder talks about it as pop psychology, pop Zen. I was using the word vernacular. That's another way to look at it, because again and again, it's that Gary Snyder is a different kind of language musician, though he does speak to the public in a simple and direct way, because both walked in the same forest, both made their own paths in the same forest for a while, in the same meadow, in the same pasture. So let me read this poem that Gary Snyder wrote for Alan Watts when Alan Watts passed away. And then at that point, then I will say what I say. This is Gary Snyder and his poem for Alan. He blazed out a new path for all of us and came back and made it clear. Explored the side canyons and deer trails and investigated cliffs and thickets. Many guides would have us travel single file, like mules in a pack train, and never leave the trail. Alan taught us to move forward like the breeze, tasting the berries, greeting the blue jays, learning and loving the whole terrain. So that's what Alan Watts is doing now in a very particular way. I hope we have looked into some of those thickets and also the clearings too. I hope we followed a little bit and seen some of the deer trails, and we haven't certainly gone in a single file. Those would be lines of language. We are understanding language to be that which, though limited, brings us to that which is not limited, and understanding the relationship between these forms, between form and formlessness. And it is good work. It is language art. So Gary Snyder, Alan Watts, the whole Bay Area, all the people, Mitrovic, all of them, right? Okay. Onward we go, and I thank you for your heroic listening. And I say to you, so long for now.